600 aircraft, gone in 2 days, and the man who sent them into battle thought he'd won. On the evening of June 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed Japan had just won one of the greatest carrier battles of the war. His returning pilots reported American carriers sunk, the enemy fleet crippled. None of it was true. Every American carrier was still operational. Ozawa's own flagship, Taiho, was already at the bottom of the sea. So was the veteran carrier Shokaku, a survivor of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz. The carrier force he commanded had effectively ceased to exist. The Americans had better trained pilots, tougher aircraft, and radar that detected the attacks dozens of miles from the fleet. They also had something Ozawa never imagined: Japan's own secret battle plan, recovered from the wreckage of a crashed aircraft months earlier. So how did Japan lose nearly 600 aircraft in 2 days, while its own commander still believed he'd won? By the spring of 1944, the war was closing in on Japan. The Americans were coming for the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These weren't just dots on a map. Airfields built there would put the new B-29 bomber within striking distance of Japan itself. America needed those islands. Japan believed it couldn't afford to lose them. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, head of the combined fleet, ordered his navy to prepare for one decisive battle. The plan? Lure the American carriers in, hit them first with land-based planes from the Marianas, then finish them off with Ozawa's carrier aircraft, striking from a range the Americans supposedly couldn't match. On paper, it was a smart plan. In practice, it depended on something Ozawa didn't have: good information. A few months earlier, on March 31st, Admiral Minichi Koga, Toyoda's predecessor, had been flying through a storm over the Philippines when his plane went down. He was killed. His chief of staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, was in a second aircraft carrying a briefcase full of secret naval plans. That plane crashed too. Fukudome survived. The briefcase didn't stay lost. Filipino guerrillas found it and handed it to Allied intelligence. Just like that, the Americans had a rough sketch of how Japan planned to fight its next big battle. It wasn't the whole picture. The documents didn't spell out every order Ozawa would give in June, and they didn't win the fight on their own. But they gave the Americans a head start on understanding how Japan would react once its inner defenses were tested. Ozawa was sailing toward an enemy that already knew, in broad strokes, the kind of fight he wanted. But the leaked plans weren't even his biggest problem. Years of fighting at Midway, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, and across the Solomons had already burned through Japan's best pilots, the ones who'd made its carrier force so lethal back in 1941. You can rebuild an aircraft in weeks. You can't rebuild a veteran aviator that fast. Fuel was running short. American submarines prowled near the fleet's anchorage at Tawi-Tawi, and real training had become almost impossible. By June 1944, some Japanese pilots were still excellent. A lot of them simply weren't ready for what was coming. Across the water, it was the opposite story. American pilots showed up with more flight hours and sharper training. Their new Hellcat fighters were fast, tough, armored, and built to survive a hit. Radar gave commanders time to see raids coming and get fighters into position before the enemy even arrived. And below them, American ships bristled with anti-aircraft guns, some firing shells that could detonate near a plane without even touching it. Japan still had the range advantage. America now had the warning, the coordination, and the firepower to make that advantage meaningless. Ozawa was also counting on hundreds of land-based planes from the Marianas to soften up the American fleet before his carriers even struck. Problem was, those planes had already been wiped out, in the air and on the ground, by earlier American attacks. The reports reaching his fleet didn't make that clear. So Ozawa launched his main attack, believing the opening blow had already landed. It hadn't. On the American side, Admiral Raymond Spruance was facing a very different call. His aviators wanted to charge west, hunt Ozawa down, and hit him first. Spruance said no. His job wasn't just to sink the Japanese fleet, it was to protect the men landing on Saipan. If he chased Ozawa and left the invasion exposed, the whole operation could unravel. It was not a popular decision with his more aggressive commanders, but it kept the American fleet exactly where it needed to be when the attack came. Ozawa spotted the Americans on June 18th. Because his planes had longer range, he figured he could strike first while staying safely out of reach. But by the time he was ready, night was falling, and many of his pilots weren't trained to land on a carrier in the dark. So he waited for morning. At dawn on June 19th, the sky over the Philippine Sea was clear. Contrails streaked across the blue. Down on the American ships, radar operators watched their screens and waited. When the first Japanese raid showed up on radar, it was still dozens of miles out. The Hellcats were already climbing to meet it. That first wave never really stood a chance. American fighters caught them far from the fleet, and planes started falling before most of the attackers had even spotted their targets. Then came the big one. A mass of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. It fell apart before it even cleared the Japanese fleet. Nervous gunners on Japan's own ships mistook part of the formation for the enemy and opened fire. Planes were shot down or turned back before they'd fired a single shot at the Americans. The ones that pushed through ran straight into radar-guided Hellcats, then into a wall of anti-aircraft fire around the American task force. The sky turned into a mess of smoke, crossing contrails and burning planes spiraling down. Sailors on deck watched the black smoke trails bend toward the water. A few Japanese crews got through anyway. Bombs hit the carriers Wasp and Bunker Hill, and the battleship South Dakota took a direct hit. But every American carrier kept operating. The knockout blow Ozawa was counting on never came. And yet, the pilots who made it back were telling him he'd won. They'd seen explosions. They'd watched planes dive through smoke and flak. In the chaos, a damaged ship became a sinking one, and a plane that simply crashed became a confirmed kill. The pilots believed what they were reporting, and Ozawa, sitting far from the action, had no real reason to doubt the men who'd just flown through it. So while his air groups were being torn apart in the sky, he was being told the American fleet was crippled. Meanwhile, underwater, 2 American submarines were doing damage he couldn't even see coming. USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at Ozawa's own flagship, the brand new carrier Taiho. One struck home. At first, the damage looked manageable. Then, leaking aviation fuel filled the ship with fumes. An attempt to clear the air through the ventilation system instead spread the vapor through the entire hull. Hours later, it ignited. Japan's newest, most advanced carrier tore itself apart from the inside. Not far away, USS Cavalla found the Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz. Cavalla fired 6 torpedoes. 3 or 4 struck the carrier. Fires spread fast, explosions followed, and Shokaku went down with most of her crew still aboard. Up in the sky, the fight was still going. One American pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, tore into a formation of Japanese dive bombers heading for the fleet. In about 8 minutes, he shot down 6 of them. When he landed back on the Lexington, someone snapped a photo of him in the cockpit, grinning, holding up 6 fingers. That picture became one of the defining images of the battle. But it captured more than one great pilot's morning. It captured the entire imbalance between the 2 air forces. Trained aviators, better directed fighters, tougher planes, and a defense system that actually worked together. Later Japanese strikes did no better. One formation couldn't even find the American carriers and turned toward Guam instead. American fighters were waiting over the airfields there too. Most of those planes were shot down or came back too damaged to ever fly again. By late afternoon, the radar screens were finally quiet. The Americans had lost fewer than 30 fighters in air combat that day. Japan's carrier air groups were essentially gone. Across the full 2-day battle, Japanese carrier and land-based aviation lost close to 600 aircraft, although exact totals vary. American losses from all causes were roughly 125, many of them during the dangerous night recovery still to come. But that evening, Ozawa still didn't understand what had actually happened. He believed most of his missing planes had simply landed on Guam to refuel. He was planning to regroup and fight again the next day. His reports told him American carriers were sunk or crippled. None of that was true. Taiho and Shokaku were gone. The airfields he'd been counting on had already been smashed, and the experienced core of Japan's naval air power, the thing that had made it so dangerous at the start of the war, had just been broken beyond repair. The next day, the Americans went looking for Ozawa's retreating fleet. At 4:05 in the afternoon, a scout plane finally found him, right at the very edge of how far an American strike could reach and still get back. Sunset was barely an hour away. Any pilot sent now would be flying home in total darkness, low on fuel, over hundreds of miles of open ocean. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher made the call anyway. Launch them. More than 200 American planes took off and flew west. They caught Ozawa's fleet near sunset and hit it hard for about 20 minutes. The light carrier Hio went down. Other ships were damaged. More Japanese planes were destroyed. Then the Americans turned back east, straight into the dark. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Pilots strained to spot a fleet that had all but vanished against the black water. Back on the Lexington, Mitscher made the decision he'd be remembered for. Turn on the lights. Every ship in the task force lit up. Running lights, deck lights, searchlights, star shells fired by destroyers to mark the way home. It made the entire fleet visible to its own exhausted pilots. It also made it visible to any Japanese submarine within miles. It was a gamble, made to save the men he'd sent out. What followed was controlled chaos. Pilots landed on whatever carrier they could find. Some mistook smaller ships for flight decks. Others ran dry and ditched in the water right beside the fleet. Around 80 American planes never made it back safely. Most lost to fuel exhaustion or rough landings, not enemy fire. Rescue ships worked through the night, and most of the men who went into the water were pulled out alive. The cost was real, but so was the contrast it revealed. America could replace a lost plane. It could rescue many of its pilots, return experienced men to duty, and absorb losses Japan could no longer afford. Japan went into this battle already short on trained replacements, and came out of it with almost nothing left. 4 months later, Ozawa sailed into battle again, this time at Leyte Gulf. His carrier decks were nearly empty. This time, his carriers weren't even meant to fight. They were bait, sent north to pull Admiral William Halsey's fleet away from the real target, the battleships closing in on the Philippines. The ships Japan had once trusted as its sharpest weapon had become a decoy. The Marianas fell not long after. American engineers built the airfields Japan had fought so hard to keep out of reach. Soon, B-29s were taking off from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, flying north toward the Japanese home islands. And that leads into another story entirely. In August 1945, a captured American pilot named Marcus McDilda sat in front of Japanese interrogators. He knew almost nothing about the atomic bomb, but to save himself, he told them America had 100 of them and invented a description so convincing his interrogators believed every word. How did one frightened prisoner make Japanese interrogators believe a lie that enormous and pass it up the chain of command? That story begins where this one ends, with American bombers operating from the islands Japan had sacrificed its carrier air power to defend, and a Japanese command struggling to understand a weapon that could end the war.